You're listening to the international hit show, the Baby Names Podcast. And here are your hosts, the Moss Sisters.
I'm Jennifer Moss.
And I'm Miranda Mendelson, subbing in for Mallory.
And we're the family behind BabyNames.com. And our first segment is always interesting names we found since the last episode. Well, I wanted to tell the story of when I was waiting for my x-ray. The tech called a boy who was about 8 or 9 years old before me and had to verify his name. The kid said his name was Vaughn, and the tech said, "Do you have another name? Because that's not what's on the record." And the kid was like, "Oh, wait," and then shouted back, "Ma, what's my real name again?" And then she shouted back, "Giovanni." And the tech accepted that. And I couldn't believe that a kid his age, like 9 years old, wouldn't know his real name. How do you not know your real name?
Well, I guess nobody called him that.
Yeah, nobody must have called him that. But Giovanni is a cool name for a little kid.
Definitely. Well, I looked up the saints' day for May 7th, and according to Catholic Online, there are a bunch of them. Some cool names are Saint Flavius, Saint Juvenal of Benevento, Saint Ludhard, Saint Quadratus.
Quadratus?
I think so. Quadratus? Okay. Quadratus. Yeah. Saint Rose Venerini, Saint Serenidus and Serenus, and Saint Villainus. My favorite, Saint Villainus. That sounds evil.
Okay. I have a couple cool saints' names for my birthday coming up on May 10. Saint Solange, Saint Alpheus, Saint Aurelian of Limoges, like the crystal, Saint Calabodius, and Saint Epimachus.
Ooh.
Sounds like one of my favorite names, Telemachus.
Wow, okay. So if I had been a boy, you would have named me Telemachus?
Telemachus.
Telemachus?
No, you would have been Alex. Your dad would never have gone for Telemachus Mendoza.
Oh, it has a ring to it, though.
Okay. Today's topic is the history of English names, and our guest is Kevin Stroud, creator and host of the History of English podcast. Kevin has been a practicing attorney in Raleigh, North Carolina for 25 years, but his side interest in the practical use of English led him to explore the history and development of the language and launch the History of English podcast, which has been live since 2012. But today, specifically, we're talking about names. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about names today.
Great. First of all, what ignited your interest in the history of English?
Well, it's a long story. It probably has something to do with the fact that I am a practicing attorney, and I deal with the English language every day. I draft a lot of documents. That's mainly what I do, contracts and trusts and those types of things, and just always being fascinated with the language and really the practical use of the language. I always make it very clear I'm not an English major. I don't have a degree in English. I'm an attorney. And so my interest in language is more the practical application of language, which is what I do in my job. And I've just always been fascinated by where words came from, how the language developed. And that was really my gateway into the podcast, because I just started researching the history of the language, etymology, and the overall development of the language, and I just found it to be a fascinating story. And like you said, back in 2012, I decided to start the podcast.
That's great. I've always had an interest in etymology as well, and I think that led me to onomastics. So how do you feel that language and names are kind of interrelated?
They're connected in many different ways. One of the things that's fascinating is the way that the history and development of names tracks along with the history and development of the language itself. And what I mean by that is, if you were to go back in time 1,000 years and go back to the Old English period and look at what's called the English language, you probably would not be able to recognize it in writing or understand it if you heard someone speaking. It was a completely different language in many respects. And the same is true for names. The names of the people during that period were radically different from the names that we use today. And so it was, a reflection and product of the culture at the time. And then, of course, the language changed in 1066 and the years that followed, when England was conquered by the Norman French.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating.
It not only changed the English language, but it changed the names,
Yeah.
because all of those kind of old, funny sounding Anglo-Saxon names, Old English names, most of them disappeared and were replaced with much more common and familiar French names, which we tend to use today. Let me give you a few examples. When people think of Old English, there's probably only one major piece of literature that people think of, and that's Beowulf.
Yeah.
And Beowulf is a very classic kind of Old English Anglo-Saxon name. A lot of names from that period, in fact, almost all names that you come across are a combination of two elements. They're almost like compound words. And Beo actually meant bee, like a honeybee, and wolf was a very common element in names. It not only meant literally a wolf, but it more generally meant a hunter. And so Beowulf literally means bee hunter, and was probably used as a poetic compound, what's sometimes called a kinning, for bear, because a bear was a bee hunter, looks for honey. But that's kind of how these names work. I mentioned wolf. Another common Anglo-Saxon name was Athelwulf. It was very, very Old English, very Germanic. And Athelwulf, we don't really use that name anymore. It's obviously disappeared. But the German language had essentially the same name. Now, we have to keep in mind that Old English came from an earlier Germanic language, which also produced German. And so the two languages are, historically related. And German had the name Athelwulf as well, which became the name Adolf.
Yeah.
Within, we do have that name in English, but we've borrowed it from German over time. But the same basic root. You would find, other Old English names with wolf. You would find Wolfstan, Wulfric. And again, connecting it to German, you have the name Wolfgang.
Yeah, Wolfgang, yeah.
Wolfgang. And so you see that element wolf very common in the older names. Athel is another common element. I mentioned Athelwulf. You would have found names like Athelstan, Athelbert, Athelbald, Athelred. Athel was a word that meant noble, and so it's very common, particularly among the kings and the royal courts, to find that name. It is ultimately the origin of the name Ethel. Ethel, it's kind of an old-fashioned name, today. With I don't know, maybe there are children, babies being named Ethel, but I just associate it with more of kind of an old-fashioned name. But it does go back to the original Anglo-Saxons. By the way, Ethelbert, which was an Anglo-Saxon name, Bert meant bright in Old English, so it meant bright, noble. German also had that name, and it produced the name Albert.
So it's kind of a contraction then of the longer name.
Right. And so this happened. These names got condensed over time. I'll give you a few others since we're talking about Old English names, because these are kind of fascinating. You have Os, O-S meant God. And so several names had that. Osgar, gar meant spear. So we have that in the word garlic, because garlic is literally a gar-leek. It's a spear leek. It's a leek or an onion-shaped vegetable that kind of looks like a spear. Well, anyway, Oscar is literally God's spear or spear god, became the name Oscar, O-S-C-A-R.
Oh, right.
And Oswald is another one. Wald in Old English, wald meant ruler. So Oswald became Oswald. It means God ruler or divine ruler. And then, of course, the Anglo-Saxons had the word God. God is an Old English word. So Godric, Godwin, ween means friend. So Godwin is friendly God. Alfred, one of the most famous kings of the Anglo-Saxon period, was Alfred the Great, the only English king to bear the name the Great. Alfred is also, of course, an Old English name. It comes from a combination of the word elf and raid, which meant advice or counsel. So it meant spiritual advisor, sort of. But Alfred survives, and most of the other names that survive begin with the name Ed, E-A-D, Ed, which meant blessed. So we have Edward, blessed guardian, Edwin, blessed friend, Edgar, I mentioned that word gar earlier, meaning spear, so blessed spear. Edmund, those names have survived. And beyond that, there really aren't very many Old English names. A few female names have survived. I mentioned Ethel, Edith. Edith, of course, in Old English, it would have been very different. It was more like Edgith or something like that. But it survives. Edith, Audrey.
Oh, that's a popular name now, Audrey. Yeah.
Old English would have been Ethelthryth. So that one's really changed. Mildred. Mildred would have been Mildthryth. Mild plus the word thrith, which meant power or strength. So mild power or mild strength, but Mildred.
Like quiet strength. Yeah, that's cool. So it was pretty much, were they describing the person's characteristic then you would use these names?
Perhaps, though, as far as I know, many of these names were given at birth.
Mm-hmm.
So they were perhaps, the parents imbuing upon the child some aspect that they wanted, hope the child would have, perhaps.
Right.
But in many cases, these were probably also family names, names that, existed within the family. There weren't that many. I think in looking through Old English documents, you tend to come across a lot of the same names over and over again. And that, by the way, continues to be a theme as we look at names during the Middle Ages. There just seemed to be a limited supply of names.
So then you said the Norman Conquest, 1066, kind of changed everything. So how did then the French and Latin influences have their effect on English baby naming?
Well, the Norman conquerors, when they arrived in 1066, they essentially impose the French language on England. And a lot of people don't realize that for the next 2 or 3 centuries, the official language of England was French. And
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the French, the common people, the peasants, they still spoke English, but the ruling class, the barons and the nobles and the aristocrats, they all spoke French and Latin. And so they really looked down on the English. They looked down on their language. They considered it a peasant language, a mere local vernacular. The language that mattered was Latin and French. Those 2 languages were most important. Latin was used in the church and in government business, and French was the language of the court. And France was such an important country in Western Europe. It was still such an important language that everyone was with any high birth and education was expected to speak French. So ultimately, what happens is these Anglo-Saxon names start to get stigmatized, and that filters down. And at some point, even the commoners, even the English speakers within England, became self-conscious, apparently. And by and large, they stopped using those existing Anglo-Saxon names, and they started to adopt names mostly from French or from the church, names that came from the Bible. Mm-hmm. So just give you a few examples. French names, even though these have been anglicized over time, but we have names like William, Stephen, Henry, Robert, Richard, Roger, Jeffrey, Alice, Matilda. Matilda was a very common female name at the time. And so these are all names basically, borrowed in from French. You'll notice a lot of royal, king names there. William, Henry, Richard. Right, these were, the royal family of England, the Normans and then the Plantagenets, all spoke French for the most part and used those names as well. Names that came from the church, names like John, Thomas, Nicholas, Catherine, Margaret, Joan, Mary. So these names came in as well. But even in the names I just mentioned, for the most part, most people settled on just a few of those. For example, boys mainly were named William or John. And there are some interesting anecdotes about that. There are records from Sheffield in England from the late 1300s, tax records. And it lists a little over 700 men by name, and over half of them were named John or William. It's just such a common name. Henry II was king in the 1100s. He held a court in Normandy 1 year across the Channel in France. And the chronicles from the period mention that there were 110 different knights at court, all named William.
Oh my God.
So it was just, for whatever reason, they just settled on like those two names. For girls, it was mostly Joan, Margaret, and Matilda. And it's really difficult if you're trying to read the history of this period, because it seems like every queen, every princess, I mean, almost every female character you encounter is named Matilda. And so it became very difficult. And that is probably one of the factors that encouraged the development of surnames or second names.
Right. I was just going to get to that. So there had to be some way to differentiate all these Williams and all these Toms and say that guy over there, or the guy who lives over by the stream, or the guy with the red hair. These are all ways that surnames were developed.
Exactly. And a lot of people don't realize that surnames are really, they're rare and almost unheard of before the late Middle Ages. If you go back to ancient Greece and of course the Norse tribes and other tribes throughout Europe, most of the history, the people you encounter have one name. The exception to the rule is Rome. Romans had a more complicated naming system where they did use multiple names, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, but that was very much the exception, very unusual. So as we get into the 1100s and 1200s in England, again, people still used one name. They didn't really have surnames. But we have this problem now. Everybody's not just using a small group of names, but they're really just settling on these, 2 or 3 different names. Everybody's using those.
And I would assume that there's a lot more people coming in as well. So
Exactly.
Cities and towns are getting bigger and bigger, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you've got the growth of cities, which is important. And then associated with that is government administration, record keeping. The Normans basically imposed what we today call the feudal system on England. It didn't really exist, before the Normans. So with that comes this large bureaucracy and comes taxes.
Yeah, and record keeping, right?
Record keeping. A lot of factors tie into the development of surnames, and we can explore that. And very often cited as the biggest factor was taxes, because in the 1300s, the English government imposed what they called a poll tax. Now, a poll tax was a new thing, very unusual, in that it was a literal tax on everybody. Usually, the landholding class paid the tax, the nobles, the barons, the people with wealth. The peasants may have paid fees and fines to their lord, but they didn't really pay taxes in the traditional sense. But suddenly in the 1300s, the government steps in and levies a tax on everybody at least over 14 years of age. And that meant that the record keepers had to go out to the countryside and make sure everyone was paying, because initially everyone didn't pay. They avoided paying it. So the tax collectors were sent out, started to keep very detailed records, and that is really a lot of other factors, but that's really one of the main factors in the development of surnames, and especially hereditary surnames.
Right.
Because if you look at the development of surnames, what you see is there was an initial stage where people very often had a second name or a surname, but it wasn't hereditary.
Meaning it wasn't passed down to generations.
Right. It was unique to the person who had the name, and when they died, the name died with them. But once you get into the 1300s, the names start to become hereditary. So you see the children and grandchildren carrying on the name. And so now we have kind of modern surnames. And most modern surnames that came out of the British Isles anyway, we can trace back to the 1200s and 1300s.
Forming these surnames, I talked about there's place names like the Bill who lived over by the field. And then we had occupational surnames as well, which we did a whole episode about because those are becoming really popular as first names like Parker, Thatcher, Sawyer. And tell me about how those came about.
Occupational surnames really developed with the rise of the cities. During this period of time, again, we're looking at the same general time frame. 1200s, 1300s, cities were starting to grow. And this is the period during which the medieval trade guilds and crafts guilds started to develop and become very important institutions. And as the towns grew, people moved in, they started to develop specialized trades and industries and crafts. Whereas previously people were kind of, jack of all trades. You could kind of do a little bit of everything. Now labor was getting to be more specialized. So if you needed a shoe, you went to the shoemaker. If you needed, metalwork, you went to the blacksmith. You went to specialized occupations. And that really lended and helped to lend to these occupational surnames, because now people were basically doing one job, and they were associated with that job. And so that became part of their name, part of their moniker. And again, going back to the idea of hereditary surnames, businesses were family businesses by and large. If you were a blacksmith, chances are, your son was going to be a blacksmith too and would take over the business. And so again, if you were Smith, one of the most common surnames in English comes from obviously the word Smith, meaning a craftsman. If you were a blacksmith, your son was likely to be a blacksmith, his son was likely to be a blacksmith. So that name tended to get carried on through several generations. But what you're right, though, in that the occupational surnames can be extremely detailed and specific. I mean, we think about the cloth making industry, and you may not realize how many different jobs there were in the cloth making industry. And each one of those jobs has an occupational surname associated with it. So you have, weavers and websters and fullers and walkers, tailor and Sherman. If you're making leather, you've got Skinner and Tanner.
Yeah.
They're all very specific jobs. And all these names develop over time. And again, they pass into the culture. Most of these names, not all of them, but a lot of them are actually French in origin. In other words, the word that they're based upon comes from French. We have a name like Fletcher. Fletcher was an arrow maker. Comes from a French word. Joiner was kind of a carpenter or craftsman that joined, pieces of wood together. Wright, another word for craftsman, an Anglo-Saxon word. But a lot of these are actually French in origin.
And you also said that sometimes physical appearance or personal characteristics came into the surnames as well.
Yeah, for surnames, you're looking at four main categories: occupational surnames, locational surnames, which you mentioned, which can be geographical features like hill, rivers, bush, or specific town names, Lincoln, Washington. One of my favorite is Townsend. Townsend is literally the town's end. It's somebody that lived on the edge of town, So you've got locational names, ancestral names. We didn't really talk about those, but they're worth mentioning. They're names that literally indicate who your parent was. So if your father was Jack, you're Jack's son.
Right. That's a huge name right now. Harrison, Jackson,
Richardson, Thompson, Stevenson. Of course, in the Celtic fringe, you have McCain, MacDonald. The Mick, again, is a naming element that means son of or descendant of. Same thing with like O'Brien in Ireland. The O kind of means descendant of. So a lot of these names, again, are just showing family lineage, ancestral in a sense, hereditary in a sense. But that's another category. And then you have the fourth category, which you mentioned, which are nicknames. And those are the fun ones.
Oh, that's right. The nicknames.
The nicknames, which are basically the ones that tend to be descriptive. Some of these are very common today. A name like Long usually meant a tall person. Short, little, young, black, usually referred to someone's hair color. White, someone, again, hair color, usually lighter colored hair. Armstrong, Newman was literally a new man. It was someone who was new in town. Hey, he was a Newman. So Truman was someone who was a truthful guy, a guy you could trust. He was honest.
Oh, trustworthy. Yeah.
Darwin is a good one. Win meant friend in Old English. We actually mentioned that earlier with names like Edwin and Godwin. Well, Darwin is Derwin. It means dear friend. dear friend.
Oh, I like that.
But then you get some really funny ones. In some of the literature, you find a name like, say, Edwin Catnessa, which is literally Edwin Cat's nose,
Oh my
because
gosh.
he had apparently a nose that resembled a cat. And you get some really interesting ones. The word bad, B-A-D, it's one of the most common words in the English language. Well, it first appears in surnames describing people. And we have names like bad cheese. I don't know what it meant. May have meant he smelled like bad cheese. I don't know. Bad in the head, but it means bad in the head. So someone who wasn't quite right, maybe a little off. They were bad in the head. Never afraid, someone who was never afraid. Stand upright means stand upright, someone who was upstanding. So we get these kinds of, surnames.
Yeah, I found that Kennedy meant ugly head, and I looked all over, or ugly or misshapen head, and people didn't realize it because it's most identified with, of course, the Kennedy family here in the U.S. But if you look up the actual definition, it's not so great.
Well, it's funny. It's funny where names come from. Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised, and a lot of them, and I have to say, in doing my research for the podcast, I'm always surprised in a lot of these names. A name like Palmer, I never really knew what Palmer meant. Well, a Palmer was a pilgrim, and specifically a pilgrim who had been to the Near East. And they always brought back a palm or a sprig from a palm tree as a souvenir. And so someone who brought a palm back home was a palmer, was a pilgrim. So at any rate, a lot of these names have a deep and interesting history behind them if you trace them down.
Yeah, I love names. There's just so much to research and find out about. And I think that they give us an insight into the history of ourselves as well. So, Kevin, this has been so fascinating.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us. And how can people find the History of English podcast?
Well, that's the name. It's the History of English podcast. So wherever you listen to podcasts, your favorite podcatcher, it should be there. It's a chronological history, and I'm currently in the Middle English period around the time of Geoffrey Chaucer. So I've still got a long way to go, but hopefully you don't need to have a background in English or history, hopefully, to enjoy it. I try to make it accessible to everyone.
What a fun project. Thank you again for joining us. And if you want to find Kevin, go over to the History of English podcast and specifically look for that episode on names. He gives a lot more detail than what we were able to cover here. Are you having a hard time coming up with names that both you and your partner love? Then get yourself a copy of the Baby Names Workbook, a step-by-step do-it-yourself guide to finding the perfect name. The Baby Names Workbook gives tips and advice on where to find baby name inspiration, the best way to name storm with your partner, and how to whittle down your list so you can find the perfect name.
It's an actual workbook that you write in, so buy one for each partner. You can start saving cool names you come across, as well as names to avoid, like names of exes, childhood bullies, and that annoying guy at work who just won't shut up. And it's the perfect size to keep in your purse or backpack.
It's available in print at Amazon.com. Just search for The Baby Names Workbook by Jennifer Moss.
And now it's time for Celebrity Baby News.
It's been announced that the royal baby's been born to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and it's a boy. The newborn is 7th in line to the British throne, behind Prince Harry. Harry was over the moon when he spoke to the press. He said, quote, "It's been the most amazing experience I could ever have possibly imagined. How any woman does what they do is beyond comprehension," unquote. I think that's really cute. So no name has been announced as of this recording, but for up-to-the-minute celebrity and royal baby news, follow us on Facebook.
Facebook.com/BabyNames.com with the dot spelled out DOT.
Yep. Or check out our baby blog at BabyNames.com/blogs. Real Housewives of Orange County alum Gretchen Rossi and her fiancé Slade Smiley, what a name, have announced the names that they've picked out for their unborn daughter. The little girl will be named Skylar Gray. The couple struggled with infertility for many years and began IVF treatments in 2014. Gretchen told People magazine that she loved the name Skylar for many years and that Slade immediately took to it. She said it represented God during her IVF journey. The middle name Gray honors Slade's 18-year-old son, Grayson, who has fought brain cancer since he was 6 years old.
Former Today host Tamron Hall and husband Steve Greener have welcomed their first child, a son named Moses. They only recently announced her pregnancy, waiting until she was 32 weeks along, and her doctors told her it was safe to do so. Hall and Green married in 2018, and the name Moses is of Egyptian origin and means born of God.
On April 29th, country singer Jake Owen and his girlfriend Erica Hartline welcomed their first child together, a daughter named Paris Hartley. Paris is Owen's second child. He's also dad to a 6-year-old daughter, Olive Pearl, with his ex-wife, Lacey Buchanan.
Carolina Panthers quarterback Cam Newton and longtime girlfriend Kia Proctor have announced they are pregnant with their fourth child. Kia has a 12-year-old daughter, Shakira, from a previous relationship. The new baby will join older siblings Chosen Sebastian, who's 3, Sovereign Dior Cambella, who's 2, and Camidus Swain, 10 months. Chosen, Sovereign, and Camidus. What do you think about those, Mom?
Well, I don't like Sovereign. It's one of those exalted names. Same with Chosen, because it's like you're the chosen one. I don't have any idea what Camidus means or Camidus. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll have to
what about
go look that up.
Shakira?
I like Shakira. That's cool. Anyway, super couple Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively revealed at the Detective Pikachu premiere that they are expecting their third child together. Husband and wife actors married in 2012 and have 2 daughters, James, 4, and Inez, 2. They waited a while also to announce this baby to the world, as the press is guessing Blake is already in her 3rd trimester.
I think James is kind of a cool name for a girl. I haven't heard it used like that before.
Yeah.
Well, actress Keira Knightley is expecting her second child with husband, musician James Wrighton. Knightley and Wrighton married in 2013 and have 1 child together, a 4-year-old daughter named Edie Knightley Wrighton.
Oh, cute. R&B singer Keisha Cole, 37, is expecting her second child with 23-year-old boyfriend Nico Cale. Woo-hoo. Their baby will join Keisha's 9-year-old son Daniel from ex-husband basketball player Boobie Gibson, real name Daniel.
Oh, good. I was worried.
Although she and Boobie split in 2014, the buzz is that the divorce is not yet final. Ooh, I think she now appears on Love and Hip Hop, so go watch that for the full story. All right, and now it's time for our segment where we take questions from you, our listeners. We only have one today. Hi, Jennifer and Mallory and Miranda. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Yay! I'm 22 and not planning on having a child anytime soon, but I've been obsessed with names and naming since I was in elementary school. I studied the Middle East at college, and I take Arabic. Recently, I was in Palestine and met a Syrian woman whose daughter was named Sena, S-E-N-A, or Sena, meaning lightning of the storm. I think this is a beautiful name with a wonderful meaning. So do you think it's okay to name my child an Arabic name if I'm not Arab myself? I would never want to be insensitive or engage in cultural appropriation, but if Sena has no religious meaning, could I use it in a culturally appreciative way? I would love to hear your thoughts on naming children something from another culture, and if this can be done. Best, May. Okay, so I'll put in my 2 cents because we've talked about this in previous episodes about cultural appropriation in baby naming. And I think Sena is perfectly okay. It's just borrowing a name from another culture. It's not the name of a god. It's not the name of a tribe. You know, we talked about using tribal names from Native Americans, and they really don't want you to do that for white babies. But I think Sina is a simple enough name that it crosses over in cultures and would be perfectly okay. What do you think of, Miranda?
Well, I think that people name their children names that they don't even know what the origin of just because they like the sound of it. So I think just the fact that you or that May is keeping that in mind is sensitive enough. And like you said, it's not a religious name. And so it's not really that she's claiming anything for herself. I think it's a really pretty name.
Yeah. So go for it, May, whenever you decide to have children or a dog or a cat. Hey, listeners, Mallory and I have been appearing on some other podcasts lately as their featured guests. Check out the Common Sense Pregnancy, Parenting, and Politics with host Jeannie Faulkner. The podcast delivers insider advice you need during pregnancy, labor, birth, and parenthood. We'll be appearing on an upcoming episode. I also talked to Christine and Sunny on their podcast, Twin Talks. We have a great conversation about naming traditions, naming conventions, and how to choose names from multiples in particular. Twin Talks is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen. Now, Miranda and I are off to Canada. I'll let you know if and when we return.
I'm so excited. And Mom, we have to return because the Social Security baby list is coming out next week.
That's right, folks. Watch for the top U.S. names of 2018 to be released soon from the U.S. Social Security Office. We'll discuss them on our next show. Thank you, sweetie, for subbing today. And listeners, please check out Miranda's blog at slashedbeauty.com.
It's all about beauty on a budget.
Bye, babe. See you in a couple days.
Bye, Mama. Love you.
Love you, too.